O God, with your word. Silence in us any voice but your own. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Last week, we marked Baptism of the Lord Sunday. We journeyed with Jesus and John into the Jordan River. And my colleague Cal reminded us of the promises made at our baptisms, encouraging us to renew and to reclaim those vows. Today, Jesus and John appear in our story once again. Cousin John, as was foretold, prepares the way for Jesus, leading people, even his own disciples, to the one who will save. I love that John's two disciples who were with him, hearing what John says about Jesus, just up and decide to follow Jesus instead from now on. And presumably John has no problem with this. After all, his job is to point to Jesus, to the Christ. Now, if you'll remember, John the Baptist is, shall we say, of the wilderness. According to the Gospel of Mark, he wore camel's hair, ate locusts and wild honey. I imagine he was very comfortable sleeping under the stars, perhaps not the most well-groomed or well-dressed, a little rough around the edges. Anyway, I imagine that as former disciples of John, these two who had followed him also followed him into that kind of wilderness, outdoorsy sort of life. And being who I am, it doesn't surprise me too much that their first question to Jesus is this: where are you staying? Okay, that's their first question. Where are you staying? Sometimes we forget that this Jesus whom we worship and honor today was a homeless itinerant preacher who walked around relying on the hospitality of strangers. He wasn't quite like his cousin John. Jesus was a little more conventional in what he wore and what he ate. But in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Jesus wasn't staying at the Ritz-Carlton or a nice Airbnb. I imagine from town to town, the question of the day would be, where are we staying? Where are you staying? Now, the culture of hospitality in Jesus' day was very different from our own. It was not unusual to put up guests in your home and to be expected to help provide them for the night, even if they were strangers. In our society, where we don't or can't always even host our own family members when they're in town, it's hard to imagine putting up a stranger. But that's what ended up happening. Now, today's story doesn't actually tell us where Jesus was staying. It doesn't tell us what Jesus and these two disciples did for the rest of the day as they remained together. But something about this whole experience convinced Andrew that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And he could not hold on to this news for himself. He had to tell his brother Simon. This story is so rich, full of ways we should all be pointing and preparing the way for Jesus, like John did. Full of ways we should be choosing to follow Jesus like these two disciples. And full of ways we should be sharing the good news of the gospel with others and inviting them to come and see and meet Jesus, as Andrew does. But what captured me in the reading this week was what happened with Simon. Simon wasn't one of the original two who went from being disciples of John to disciples of Jesus. I'm not sure what Simon was doing or where he was, but he was close enough for his brother Andrew to go and get him. And when Andrew brings Simon to Jesus, Jesus says, "You are Simon, son of John. You are called to be Cephas," which is translated to Peter. Now, the name Simon in Hebrew means to listen, or to hear. It's a beautiful name with deep meaning. And the name Cephas, or Peter, means rock. And this very Peter is whom Jesus will later say will be the rock on which the church is built. But as we get to know this disciple, we find out that he does not have the most steady, level-headed, or rock-like personality. He's impulsive, excitable, eager, and passionate, and those aren't necessarily bad attributes, just not attributes you think of when you think of someone as the rock in the relationship. I wonder if his brother Andrew, witnessing this name change, was thinking, maybe you should get to know him a little bit first. But God, throughout Scripture, and Jesus here did this from time to time, changed the names of people as they saw something in them that was more than who they currently are. One of my favorite quotes by Anne Lamott is, "I do not at all understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us." There's this sense that Jesus meets Simon exactly where he is and for who he is. But Jesus can see beyond that too, and Jesus does not leave us where he finds us. Jesus knows the transformation that will take place. The person whom Simon is meant to be, the person whom Simon is called to be, is Peter. Long before Simon is like a rock to anyone, let alone the church, Jesus calls him Peter, Petros, so that he can start living into that role, however imperfectly that may be. Now, names are tricky. Our family has been trying to come up with a name for the new baby without much luck or agreement. It doesn't help that a 6-year-old seems to get a say in this. And some people love their name, some people hate their name, some people even choose to change their name, and for some immigrants in this country, have their name changed for them. My husband Mike was called Mike by his 4th grade teacher, and it just stuck since he immigrated. But all names have some kind of meaning or significance or story to them, whether you like it or not. My name is Joanne Hejong Lee. My parents found my first name, Joanne, in just some random baby book. Its Hebrew roots mean God is gracious, which they liked, and it kind of corresponded with my Korean name, so they went with it. My legal middle name is also my Korean name, the one that I went by long before I started school, and it was given to me by my dad's dad, my paternal grandfather. It's Hejong. Every graduation, someone would butcher the pronunciation of my middle name, no matter how many times I said it for them. Joanne Lee is easy enough. Joanne Hejong Lee, however, is impossible to pronounce. The first part of my Korean name, He, means grace. And the second part, Jong, means bell. So together, Hejong means to ring out God's grace like a bell. Now, I'm sure that in many ways, my grandfather's hope for my life was that I would ring out God's grace to a world that is too often deprived of grace, that somehow who I am and how I might live be a bell signaling the grace of God to all. But lately I've been wondering and rethinking that perhaps this name wasn't just meant to be outward and performative, but perhaps my grandfather's hope would also be that I would hear and experience the bells of God's grace for myself in my own life, each and every day. So what does your name mean? Do you know? Are you named after someone? Who got to name you? Does it resonate with you? Is it something you strive for or something you'd rather put behind you? Whatever name is given to us by our parents or grandparents or whomever, I believe when we choose to follow Jesus, we are all given a new name. We are each and every one of us called beloved. We are the beloved children of God. You are beloved. You are beloved. Period, full stop, end sentence. Now this weekend, we honor the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was a preacher, and he knew his name was beloved. People called him all kinds of things as he marched, was imprisoned, was slandered in the media, and eventually assassinated. But he knew his name was beloved. And he was not shaken by what others chose to call him. Dr. King knew he wasn't perfect, but he was still beloved. And so even with all of his faults and flaws, mistakes and missteps, he had the audacity to dream and hope and proclaim justice for all. In his Beyond Vietnam speech, Dr. King named for us, the American people, some of the deep ills and sins of this nation. The sins of racism, materialism, and militarism. Still today, we as a nation struggle with these deeply embedded sins. In recent years, we've seen extreme racism rear its ugly head in bold and unapologetic ways that we thought and hoped were behind us. Our planet, our people, and our purses suffer from the greed and dissatisfaction caused by materialism and conspicuous consumption. And oh, how easily we turn to violence and war to solve deeply complicated issues that will not be won by killing each other or sending troops to other countries. Racism, materialism, militarism. Some would say these are the names of our country. But even as Dr. King named these three as the primary sins of this nation, he also believed that we could be so much more. Grace meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us. Dr. King dreamed big, and he dared to dream of a country whose name could be justice, liberty, freedom for all, and equality for all. He dreamed of what he called a beloved community. Note that word, beloved. A beloved community where these dreams might be realized. That name, beloved, is not just for individuals, but for the whole community. As Maya Angelou once said, while I know myself as a creation of God, I am obligated to realize and remember that everyone else and everything else are also God's creation. So how do we honor the name beloved in ourselves and in others? How do we help usher in the kind of world that Dr. King dreamed of? He didn't live long enough to see that dream realized, but he had hope that it was within reach. And there are so many ways that we might take part in making that a reality. For each of us, we are called in ways that are unique and specific to our gifts and strengths. I preach, but I don't preach like Dr. King. We can march, we can lead, we can serve, we can inspire others, we can feed one another and make each other laugh. We can write letters, get arrested, sing together, or weep together. We can run for office or phone bank for someone we really believe in. We can refuse to be silent or choose to keep silent so that the voices of those who have long been silenced might be heard. We each have a part to play in building that beloved community. At Dr. King's funeral, Aretha Franklin sang his favorite gospel song, Precious Lord. So friends, perhaps today and every day, one thing we can do is to come together with others, allow ourselves to dream, claim the name of beloved, and simply let God take our hand and lead us into unknown futures yet hoped-for dreams, into a home where we all belong, where all are safe, and all are indeed beloved.